May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord. I am the bread of life. This is the way our gospel begins this morning. It is also the way that the gospel of last week ended. I am the bread of life. It is also one of those I am statements that John uses, that Jesus says in the Gospel of John. I am the gate. I am the true vine. I am the bread of life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. These I am statements are different from saying, I am going out to get some bread from the store. It is different from saying, I'm going out to wash the car. These I am statements refer to whom Jesus really is. And it goes back to the time of Moses. Moses, as you recall, saw the bush that was burning, but not being burned up. He couldn't figure it out. He went closer. And as he got closer, a voice said, Moses, take off your shoes. You are on holy ground. And as he got closer then to the bush, God spoke to him. Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Moses said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm a wanted man. But God persuades him. He says, I will be with you. You don't need to worry about anything. And then Moses finally relents, and he says, okay, if I go, who shall I tell the people is sending me? What is your name? And God says, I am who I am. Tell them I am sent you. And this is the key, and this is what Jesus picks up on here. This little phrase, I am. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. By using this I am statement, he is saying he is part of the divinity. He is of God and from God. If we look at the Gospel of John, we see that this is the way he presents Jesus. Remember how it starts. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that Word then came down and dwelt among us as Jesus, as the Son of God, as ultimately what we would say the second person of the Trinity, the Son. And he is down on earth for a while and then rises back to heaven after the crucifixion and resurrection. John plainly speaks of him as being of God and from God. I'd like to add a little bit to that to make it easier, because I think that this gospel presents the resurrected Christ as coming to you, to me, and to everyone. It is the resurrected Christ who is speaking to us. And yes, it has a setting in the life of Jesus with people who are known and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, when he says, I am the door, I am the bread of life, I am the true vine, I am the good shepherd, I am the way, the truth, and the life, I am the resurrection and the life. He is saying this after his crucifixion and resurrection. He can't be these things before. He is this after this has happened. And so he calls to us as the resurrected Christ calls to us. I am the bread of life. When I was a boy, every year around September, my mother would go out to the grocery store and she'd buy a box of 30 pounds of plums. They were these little Italian prunes. And she would open up a couple of them before she bought the box to make sure that the pit came right out, that it was a free stone. Because otherwise it would be a real problem, a pain in the neck. She'd take the box home, and the following Saturday, a great aunt of mine joined her, and the two of them began to work on this 30-pound box of plums. She had this cauldron on the stove, and they would begin to pit the plums, and as they got a smaller pot full, they would dump it into this cauldron and put a low fire on it. They would continue to do this until all of the plums were pitted. But every 3 to 5 minutes, it was essential that they would take a spatula and scrape the bottom of this big cauldron. Because the last thing in the world that they needed was to have the plums burned. If the plums burned, there would be this terrible taste, and you might as well just throw all 30 pounds out. And so they watched over this huge pot for hours. They probably cooked it 7 hours. Because, you see, the plums had to break down. And the juice from the plums had to evaporate. They got it into a slow boil. But still, every 3-4 minutes, one of them got up and scraped the bottom of the pot. And while this was going on, she also had another pot boiling, and she put the jars in there to purify them, so that when she put the jam in them finally, there would be no bacteria. After about 5 hours, 4 hours maybe, they'd begin to put sugar in. 6, 7 cups of sugar. They put in sticks of cinnamon, and they put in cloves. And then they would take they'd stir it around, and then they'd take a spoon, and they'd each taste it. And my great aunt would say, well, Lena, what do you think? Does it need a little more sugar? And so they might have added another cup of sugar, maybe 2 cups. It all depended on the plums, you see. Everything was done by taste. Maybe it needed more cinnamon, more cloves. But this is the way the thing was done, and it took a long time. Well, anyway, there were several recipes that I wanted to make sure I had for my mother after she was no longer able to cook, and this was one of them. And so after she moved to Pennsylvania, I began to do the plums. And in the beginning, I bought a 30-pound box. And I did the same thing that she did. Cooked all day long, making plum jam. Now, I only do maybe 10 to 15 pounds. I don't need to do quite as many pounds of plums. But anyway, so this one September, I did the jam making. My mother at this point had to be put into a nursing home in Pennsylvania. And I took a jar down with me on a visit. And we sat down, we were talking, and I showed the jar to my mother. I said, look what I brought you, some plum jam. And the first thing out of her mouth was, where's the rye bread? Well, I had already thought about that. And I'd gone to the store. Over the course of my youth, I'd probably been to the bakery hundreds of times, because every time after church they would give me a quarter. Go around the corner to the bakery and get a Jewish rye without seeds, sliced, for a quarter. And so I got a rye bread that I brought down there. The rye bread, when it's fresh, is delicious. I've said often I could eat half a loaf just by myself when it's fresh like that. 2-3 days later, you can't. But when it's really fresh, it's delicious. It makes the plum jam. The combination is great. But you put the bread in your mouth and you chew it, and the saliva gets all the juices going in it. You can really taste it, and you swallow it, and that bread becomes part of you. Some of it, of course, is waste, but other parts become, your cells, your capillaries, whatever, your blood. It nourishes you. The bread is part of you. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. When we believe what he is saying to us, this bread of himself becomes part of us. We act accordingly. We live accordingly. It's like if you have a presidential candidate saying certain things that you resonate with, you're gonna vote for that candidate. You might even go out and help that particular political party because it's meaningful to you. It's part of you. He is the bread of life. He gives us something we can't get anywhere else. The Gospel of John doesn't have the story of Jesus giving out the bread and saying, this is my body, and then a little later giving out the wine saying, this is my blood. He doesn't have that story. But he knows it. He knows of it. But what he has right here in our passage is an interpretation now of the bread that he gives. The bread he gives us is for forgiveness. This becomes part of us. We take it into ourselves. We believe that we are forgiven by the resurrected Christ. That now God looks on us as his sons and daughters. And we share that then, that forgiveness with other people. I want to read just a short little couple paragraphs of President James Laney of Emory University. This was in the Emory magazine, the summer of 1993. In his baccalaureate address last year, the president, James Laney of Emory, told the graduates how Bishop Tutu had quietly, graciously affected the context around him just by being and acting according to his own nature. Bishop Tutu, as you recall, was the archbishop down in South Africa, and he had much to do with apartheid. He goes on, he says, last year Archbishop Desmond Tutu was in residence here for a few months, and he came to see me one day in my office. He came in and looked around and said, Jim, I think before we begin to talk, we should have a word of prayer. I said, well, of course. How was I going to say no? And so he prayed. It was a very lovely, gentle, kind affirmation. I am an ordained minister, but there are not very many prayers said in that office, I'm embarrassed to say. It is an administrative office, I tell myself. But you know, that prayer changed the context of our conversation. He wasn't trying to get anything from me, but it really made things different. When he left, I felt better because he had been there. He goes on to say, I will upgrade this illustration a good bit when I tell you that within the next few weeks, Archbishop Tutu called on the chairman of one of America's top corporations in New York City. I saw that chairman, a friend of mine, several weeks later, and he said, isn't Tutu at Emory with you? I said, well, yes, for a few months. My friend said, you know, he came to see me. Strangest thing. He walked in the office and the first thing he did was look around. I thought that's what he did in my office. And then my friend said, Tutu asked me, would you indulge me and let me have a word of prayer? I looked at this powerful business executive with a kind of smile and said, did you? And he said, of course. That's the first time anybody ever prayed in that office. And then my friend became uncommonly solemn, perhaps reflecting on the trouble that had descended on him and his company. And he said, after Tutu left, I wondered what would have happened if he had come to see me 2 years ago. I did not pursue that. It was not my place. But I think what was going through his mind was what had gone through my mind. And for a moment, we saw things in a different context, a larger perspective. Tutu knew Jesus as the bread of life. He had eaten the bread and the wine that is given at communion. He had eaten the good news that came from Jesus. It was now part of him, part of his cells, part of his very nature. And he couldn't help but want to share that with these two men, two different situations. He shared that through prayer. I am the bread of life. It's a word, it's a promise, it's the living Christ coming to us saying, take and eat. Let it become part of you. Because it is through this that you are forgiven by God. You are His forever. And it brings new life to you, knowing that you are at one with God. Knowing that through sharing of this, you can become one with your fellow man. Amen. The peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts, your minds in Christ Jesus. Let us sing now hymn number 542.